Right, so welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name's Emily. I am the Communications and Marketing Officer for our advocacy team here at Cheshire Wildlife Trust, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. So we're just going to do a few bits of housekeeping before we hear from our speakers. So you'll notice that your cameras and your microphones are all switched off, and that's for the presentations. Hopefully we'll be able to switch them on at the end of the presentations for our Q&A session. But if you would like to contact us during the webinar, please use the chat function at the top kind of middle of your screen. You should have a little chat bubble. And then right next to that, there is also a Q&A function as well. So we'd love you throughout our two talks today to put some questions in the Q&A, and my colleague Rachel, who is our crucial tech support for today, will be able to read out your questions at the end for Laura and Mélusine to answer. So why are we all here today? Today's webinar is all about our local wildlife, our work for local wildlife sites. It's a vital way of protecting wild spaces, and it's the current focus of our fundraising efforts. The current local wildlife sites appeal launched in March this year and was featured in Your Wildlife Spring Summer Edition, which is our membership magazine. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that we have raised almost 97% of that target of £35,000. And this money is used to fund the work of both Laura and Mélusine, who you'll be hearing from today. And the aim of the appeal is to be able to designate 10 new local wildlife sites this year. So Laura, who is our first speaker today, is our conservation officer. And Laura surveys and designates local wildlife sites. And our second speaker for today is Mélusine, and Mélusine is our planning and advocacy officer. So her role is to defend local wildlife sites that might be at risk from development. So hopefully that's everything from me. As I said, any comments in the chat box, please, and any questions in the Q&A box. And I will hand over now to our first speaker, Laura.
Thank you. Right. Hello, everyone. Hopefully that's moved on to the next slide.
It has.
Great. So, yeah, thank you, everyone, for coming along. I'm going to start off by telling you what local wildlife sites actually are. So, put simply, they are Cheshire's last remaining semi-natural habitats and last good bits for nature. So that could be, for example, a former quarry that's been made into a country park that's now really good for wildlife. And these sit alongside our legally protected sites, such as SSSIs and Ramsars. So there are over 44,000 local wildlife sites across the country. And in Cheshire, we have just over about 1,000 of them. Local wildlife sites are defined by DEFRA as sites with substantial nature conservation value. And this value is actually determined at the local level. So there are different local wildlife site partnerships all across the country which operate independently, and each with their own set of selection criteria. The Cheshire Local Wildlife Site Partnership covers Cheshire West, Cheshire East, the Wirral, Warrington and Halton, whereas Merseyside and Manchester have a separate system and criteria which reflects their more urban environment. So, local wildlife sites are selected for the regionally important habitats and/or species that they support. They will often have priority habitats and species present as well, and there are certain types that are more prevalent in Cheshire, such as waxcap and acid grasslands, as well as the peatlands and wetlands that are associated with our meres and mosses landscape. And this then links to some of the more important species for Cheshire as well, which you can see pictures of on this slide, such as reptiles like grass snakes, the lesser silver water beetle, water voles, great crested newts, and also the willow tit. There are many more, that's just a few. So as I mentioned, local wildlife sites can be selected for both habitats and species, but it's much more common for habitats to be the main criteria. Since they can generally be determined on a single visit by a surveyor like me, whereas many species might require repeat visits or more specialist skills and equipment. But there are actually some local wildlife sites that are only designated for the species they support. For example, there are some allotments near Frodsham, which are home to a breeding population of slow worms, and there's no habitat criteria there, just those species, and that's what's really important about that site and got it designated. There'll also be some lengths of watercourse, which maybe aren't the best type of habitat, but they are home to breeding water voles, and that would get them designated. So local wildlife sites can vary hugely from one to another in both size and shape. Some sites might encompass an entire woodland or a really long stretch of river corridor, whereas others can be less than 1 hectare in size, for example, a road verge, and they're even smaller features such as single ponds or ancient trees. They also differ in their ownership. So some are owned by local authorities and also other conservation organisations, NGOs, such as the Canal and River Trust and Woodland Trust, but the majority are on private land. A handful of local wildlife sites are highly accessible, such as nature reserves and country parks. Others might just have a single public right-of-way crossing them, but the majority don't have any public access at all. So aside from the highly important wildlife that they support, local wildlife sites are also a really vital component of Cheshire's ecological networks. So we all know how much more fragmented our landscape is now, with increasing barriers to species mobility. But local wildlife sites can provide some continuity in a busy landscape. The diagram on the left is a representation of an ecological network in the style of a tube map. And although local wildlife sites are only mentioned once in that diagram, there are actually many other elements which can also be selected as a local wildlife site. This includes canals, allotments, as I already mentioned, former quarries, species-rich hedgerows, and ponds. So it's important to note that a local wildlife site designation is non-statutory, with no legal protection. But they do in fact cover as much as Cheshire as our legally protected sites. So that's around 6% each and 12% in total. You can see it on the map on the right, how the areas of yellow, which are local wildlife sites, create a network across Cheshire, linking up those bigger, rarer statutory red sites. In fact, in a well-known report by Professor John Lawton, which is all about making space for nature, it states that we need more sites for nature, we need them to be bigger and in better condition, and to be more connected in the landscape. And local wildlife sites are one of the best ways for us to achieve this. They not only support the more common wildlife we see visiting our gardens, but they're also really important for nature conservation in their own right, as they provide sanctuaries for threatened species. Local wildlife sites also include linear features such as hedgerows, road verges, and rivers, and these are sometimes referred to as nature's highways. By getting more local wildlife sites designated and in better management, we can really strengthen these local ecological networks and boost nature's recovery across Cheshire. So now I'm going to move on to the work that you've all generously donated towards and that I've been working on more this summer. So there are these additional areas that we know are important for wildlife, and they're not currently designated. So this is why we hold a database of potential local wildlife sites. This is to record where further important wildlife areas exist, but they've not yet been formally surveyed. These sites have been identified using existing data sets, such as Natural England's Priority Habitat Inventory, or via ecological surveys, which are done for planning purposes, by colleagues at Cheshire Wildlife Trust and also other partner organisations, and occasionally by members of the public. There are approximately 800 potential local wildlife sites across Cheshire, which is shown on the map on the left, but they've been enlarged to make them more visible because actually many of these sites are really small, and in total they cover about 1% of Cheshire. In fact, almost half of these sites are traditional orchards, which Cheshire is particularly well known for, and they can have exceptionally high levels of biodiversity for their relatively small size. supporting many pollinators and birds. So earlier on this year, I had to decide how to select which of these 800 sites to focus on. And I ended up with a short list of around 50 by focusing on the peripheries of some of our urban areas and also on some particular habitats and species that are at greater risk than others. So in the end, I decided to contact around 30 different landowners, and thankfully I got enough permissions to do my surveys. So thank you to all those landowners who did allow me access to survey their land. We really appreciate it. And here are just some of the photos of the sites which I surveyed this year. I actually have my final survey next week, but I've been to some really lovely sites so far. So there were 2 species-rich grasslands which really stood out for me. Firstly, there was this really lovely steep-sided bank grassland, sort of on the outskirts of Chester, and it just had masses of black knapweed and devil's bitscabious, and also a load of heath marsh orchids, which you can see there on the photos. And yeah, it was just a really special site. There was also, you could tell there was evidence of where badgers had been sort of rooting for the pig nuts under the ground. Yes, there's obviously just a lot of wildlife going on there, and it was really lovely. And there was another steep sloped grassland that I visited where there was just this carpet of bird's foot travel all along the top of the slopes, which had loads of bees all along it, and it was really lovely. I've also been to some wet woodland sites, which had great ground flora and lots of dead wood left within them, which is fantastic habitat for lots of species. And a particularly nice orchard that I went to, where there was lots of moss and lichen growing on these old fruit trees, which was quite special. So now on to the all about the management of local wildlife sites. So when I'm undertaking a survey, I quite often get an opportunity to speak with the landowner when I'm there about how they're currently managing their land. So we do provide written advice afterwards as well, but these in-person conversations can be really helpful to understand what they currently do and why. And then I can offer advice on how this could perhaps be better adapted to suit the species and habitats that they've got present. Although development is a huge risk to our local wildlife sites, one of the biggest problems we actually have is management. So as mentioned, local wildlife sites are usually privately owned, and there is no obligation or legal requirement for them to be managed. And then it's fairly easy for these sites to deteriorate pretty rapidly with the wrong management. There are those sites which are being well managed and maintained, but that's usually because they're owned by a conservation agency, for example, or they have another remit which requires land management, such as nature reserves, or those sites that have public access. There are other sites which have agri-environment schemes, which pay the landowner to farm it sympathetically. But for many sites, it can be difficult to access funding. For example, the majority of our species-rich grassland in Cheshire remains on steep slopes, which are really difficult to access with machinery and even sometimes livestock. There can be quite a high amount to pay for fencing a site, for example, and some of these are quite small. So you can see here on the far left, there was actually a steep-sided slope which had been cut and raked as part of sort of a volunteering day activity. So this is one option, but there's obviously, as I said, about 1,000 local wildlife sites out there, and we need to look at all the options. Another issue can come with those sites whose primary focus is not nature conservation. So, for example, I visited a churchyard which had some really fantastic grassland, but the species were struggling to flower and set seed in areas that were too frequently mown. So some species can cope better with this by reducing the height of their flowering stalks. You can see in the bottom middle photo, there's some self-heal that's like crouched down among the cut grass. And some other species can flower quite rapidly in between cuts, and that's how they get around that. But there were some species that were only seen flowering in those bits which were left unmown. And then one of the problems faced by our woodland local wildlife sites is that for a landowner to access agri-environment funding, they first of all need to pay for a woodland management plan to be written up. So there's kind of this initial investment of time and money, which can put many off, unfortunately. And again, a lot of these sites can be quite small. It's also quite interesting when you're providing management advice on transitional habitats. So we have a lot of habitats where it's trying to be one thing and then it's slowly turning into another through a lack of management over time or change in hydrology. So this is on the right, one of those sites. It's a heathland site, but it's gradually becoming more and more wooded with birch mainly. And so it's about getting that management advice right and getting the best you can for the wildlife. So it is a tricky situation managing local wildlife sites, but we are hopeful that there'll be more incentives for landowners going forward, particularly with the imminent publication of Cheshire's local nature recovery strategy. And the government does plan to continue agri-environment schemes, so there is hope. I also think there's a lot of untapped potential in local communities. So for those more urban and accessible local wildlife sites, there are people that really want to act. They have a lot of useful skills, but perhaps are unaware of these precious sites on their doorstep and what they might be able to do to help. Many could be improved, for example, through the control of invasive species like Himalayan balsam. And these sort of small, awkward grasslands could be managed by volunteers, as we saw in that previous photo, with sort of cutting and removal. And there are a few examples of where local communities are getting involved with local wildlife sites. One example is Asprey Country Park in Congleton. That's owned by a charitable trust, and there is some management and recording of species done by volunteers. This is also another really good example on this slide. This is Paddington Meadows in Warrington. The site is owned by the council, but there is a huge amount of involvement from local people and different volunteering groups. They both help to manage the site and they also record loads of the amazing wildlife that is found there. So they produce these reports based on all these biological recording days they do, and it's just fantastic. Not only do we get these amazing photos, we also get a good idea of what sort of condition the site is in and what special wildlife are visiting there year on year. So during the surveys I do in the summer, it's really important for me to collect all the necessary information I need to provide evidence to support the site's designation. So I can't note down everything, not every species, every sign of fauna. I need to be practical, and all these sites are different sizes, and I just need to really focus on those important indicator species and get as much information as I can while I'm there. But once that survey is completed, we provide the documents to the landowners and consult them on the reasons for the site's selection. And we also include management advice at that point, which they can choose to follow to maintain and improve the site. We then gather all this information together and present it to the local wildlife site partnership to propose these new sites for designation. So local wildlife sites are approved by partnership, not by us alone, and that includes local authorities, local wildlife groups, Natural England, and the County Biological Record Centre. Although Cheshire Wildlife Trusts are the lead member of the Cheshire Partnership, we cannot do anything without the approval of the other partners, and sites can only be selected if they meet certain criteria, and even a small boundary change of an existing local wildlife site would have to be approved at partnership meeting. As the lead member, we do look after the data relating to Cheshire's 1,000 local wildlife sites, and we also maintain the potential local wildlife site layer that I discussed. We consult on behalf of the partnership. So, for example, if a local wildlife site is going to be affected by something unavoidable, like infrastructure works, or there is going to be a woodland management plan written for that site, I can use the species and habitat data we hold for that site to advise on how best to write that management plan, taking into account the ground flora, for example, or reducing any negative impacts from the infrastructure works. So yes, now it's the end of the summer and I've just got one more site to survey. The next steps for me are to write up all my survey notes and species lists, digitize habitat maps and consult with the landowners. Then sometime during the winter, I'll be holding one meeting per local authority where sites are due to be proposed for selection. And that so far is Cheshire West and Cheshire East and Warrington. And at that partnership meeting for those 3 different areas, we'll discuss each of the sites in turn, and hopefully they'll all meet with partnership approval and will be designated, which then means they have some protection in local planning. And this is where I'm going to pass on to Mélusine to tell you all about that line of work.
Hi, hopefully everyone can hear me. Once local wildlife sites are formally designated, they're a great tool for advocating for wildlife within the planning system, which is my role at the Trust. So there are 3 main ways that local wildlife sites come into planning, as I've written out here on the slide. So one of the ways they're considered is in the local plan, both in the policies and in the allocations, which we feed into and try to influence through the public consultations. So in image labeled number 1, you can see the proposed areas for growth around Northwich from the last consultation event on the upcoming Cheshire West and Cheshire local plan. So those are sites in and around Northwich that could be allocated for development. So if a site is already formally designated as a local wildlife site, it'll be excluded from consideration for allocation when the local planning authority decides which sites to put forward for development. And then in the local plan's policies, there will be specific protections against development on locally designated sites, which usually refer to local wildlife sites, or sometimes other ones like local nature reserves or sites of biological interests, SBIs, which are actually just the old name for local wildlife sites. So on a more local level, there can also be protections for local wildlife sites through neighborhood plans. So these are parish level policies that allow communities to have more of a say on how development happens in their area. So we sometimes get commissioned by parish councils to produce a natural environment report where we assess the biodiversity in the area and provide recommendations on how to improve it and protect it. And in the report, we make these wildlife corridor maps, which you can see an example of in image number 2. So it's a desk-based study, so it doesn't include any on-the-ground surveys, but it's basically a map that connects all of the good bits for nature. So that's obviously all of the local wildlife sites, but then it's also areas of good habitat like woodland and grassland, and linear connections as well, like brooks and hedges. And then we really encourage this map to be included in the neighborhood plan that the parish council produces, specifically with a policy that says that the wildlife corridor will be protected from development. But sometimes these policies aren't enough to protect local wildlife sites, and we still get planning applications that threaten to impact one on site or nearby. So as you can see in image number 3, this was an application in Poynton recently that is directly adjacent to an ancient woodland local wildlife site. So in that case, we first try to talk to the developers to see if they can avoid any impacts to the local wildlife site through the design of the scheme. And then otherwise, we will send in comments or objections citing the policy in the local plan that it goes against. And for really big schemes, we'll talk with the local planning authority as well. So either the biodiversity officer or the case officer for the application, with the goal being obviously to prevent any damage to the local wildlife site and maybe even get some improvements to it. So we've had several big projects that showcase the role that local wildlife sites play in our planning work, so I will go through a few of them here. So this is Long Ridge Local Wildlife Site, which you may have heard about in the last few years because there got to be quite a big campaign around it. So the site was actually originally allocated for development in the Cheshire East Local Plan, despite knowledge that it contained really good wildlife. And then a year or two later, in 2017, the Knutsford Parish Council approached us to write up a natural environment report to inform their local plan or their neighborhood plan. And we identified this area on the eastern edge of Knutsford as being potentially really good for wildlife, subject to surveys. So when a big planning application came in for several hundred houses, the local community alerted us. We did some surveys from the public footpath, and we saw that it was actually really good for wildlife with a mosaic of important habitats, lots of birds and butterflies, generally just a really good piece of land for nature. So we sent in an objection to the planning application on this basis. And then at the same time, we managed to get the local wildlife site process going pretty quickly. We designated it while the decision by the council was still pending. So we sent renewed objections saying that it was now a local wildlife site, that development on it would go against policies in the local plan, etc. And the council ended up voting unanimously to deny it. Of course, the applicants appealed the decision, and last November we represented at the planning inquiry to advocate for the site and that it shouldn't be built on. Unfortunately, the planning inspector decided that the benefits of the development outweighed the damage to nature and decided to approve the development. So not much of a happy ending for Long Ridge, unfortunately, but many lessons were learned, hopefully by the council as well. And it's actually a really good example of the different ways that local wildlife sites come into play in planning. And it's also a good reminder that their protection is actually quite precarious and that there's still quite a bit of advocacy for us to do. So that sentiment brings me to Frodsham Marshes, which is at the forefront of quite a few of our current projects. So if you don't know about Frodsham Marshes, it's the area adjacent to the Mersey estuary, between the estuary and the M56 that goes by Frodsham and Helsby. It used to be the floodplain for the Mersey River, and it's still a really important site for birds that use the estuary, but it was kind of cut off by the Manchester Ship Canal, and then it's been a hotspot for industry and infrastructure development in the last 30 years. So the efforts to develop it have been renewed in the last year, and there's now an application for a solar farm covering most of the area, as well as several high net pipelines. As kind of a side project, I mapped out all of the planning boundaries for development on the Frodsham, Helsby, and Ince Marshes local wildlife site. And the red line boundaries currently cover about 65% of it. So to say it's threatened by development is a bit of an understatement. So I'm objecting to the developments on the basis that they're on local wildlife site, but also because the schemes are likely to be really damaging and there likely won't be enough mitigation to compensate. And I've been working to try to negotiate with the developers. I've been talking to the local authority to influence their response. And there will be much more work down the line. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of the work that we do around local wildlife sites and how important they are to our conservation work at Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So Laura and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much to both Laura and Mélusine for that. At the moment, no questions in the Q&A, but if anyone other than mine, which I'll ask in a minute, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A chat box. So my question, and I don't know, this might be a joint answer. If a site does get designated as a local wildlife site, can this be a springboard to help the site gain further designations and protections? And like, do you guys have any examples of when that's happened?
Ooh,
Whoa.
that's a good question. Generally they do remain at local wildlife site level, because it's very rare for things then to be upgraded to something like a legal site, like a triple SI.
Okay.
Because a triple SI is an example of a good example or the best in the area of a really rare habitat. So they've already kind of been bagged. But recently, with was it National Nature Reserve scheme, I think? A local wildlife site, I think in Warrington, recently became a national nature reserve. And so we're now discussing whether it stops being a local wildlife site. So if it gets a greater protection like that legal one, then it doesn't need that local wildlife site designation anymore. It's kind of an upgrade.
But we, adding on to that though, we have seen local wildlife sites, nationally designated sites like triple SIs, which stand for sites of special scientific interest, by the way. So that's a national designation. And we have seen those undesignated or declassified back down to local wildlife site because the management just wasn't good enough to keep it at the in the condition that it's supposed to be in to be a nationally designated site. So unfortunately, we see it go the other way around quite a bit more.
Okay. We have had a question in the chat as well, saying much of your work seems to be in Mid and North Cheshire, East and West. Are there any of these sites being looked at in the South?
Is that relating to local wildlife site designations? Oh, yeah, I'm trying to think how far south. There is kind of a general concentration of potential local wildlife sites. The traditional orchards are quite well distributed across the county, but otherwise, as I mentioned, we kind of get them through different data sources, and quite often that is when there's planning going on and ecological surveys are done, and that sort of notifies us to new potential local wildlife sites. So they can spring up a lot where there's more urban areas. So it can be a bit skewed. It's not always well distributed across the county. But yeah, also I looked at a really big spread of sites, but it gets narrowed down and then narrowed down further depending on whether the landowner grants permission, which is maybe the hardest bit of the process. There's a lot of people who are nervous and unsure about having something designated on their land, even when I explain that it's non-statutory, no obligation or that sort of thing. Just people are very wary of it. So yeah, it can just be difficult to get on people's land in the first place, unfortunately.
Lovely, thanks, Laura. We've had a question from Kevin saying, is there a publicly available list of local wildlife sites? It'd be useful to know which sites are already designated so the public can suggest potential sites for consideration.
So this is variable as well. So I'm aware on the Cheshire West Council website, local wildlife site boundaries are published. I don't think there's equivalent for Cheshire East, and I'm not sure. Is there for Cheshire East?
There is actually in the on the Cheshire East planning website, they have a map of all of their policies. It's a difficult map to use, so it probably wouldn't be very helpful to look for local wildlife sites. But if you have a location, I'm pretty sure it has locally designated sites on there. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. And they'll be the boundaries from when we last held partnership meetings. So it is out there with a bit of digging.
Thank you. Another question is, what is the position when a new owner of a local wildlife site mows the meadow as if it was a lawn? Does it lose its designation? And if so, how do we report it?
So if you're concerned that you know the local wildlife site that's being maybe not sympathetically managed, you can let us know at Cheshire Wildlife Trust. If we have the landowner details, we can contact them and just remind them of what the site is and why it's important. One of the problems with the local wildlife site system is that there is no need to let new owners know that there is a local wildlife site on your land. So land is sold and there's nothing, you know, like how you do searches for different things, like flood risk and all that sort of thing when you buy new property and land. There's no search for local wildlife sites. So people will buy land and not know there's a local wildlife site there, unfortunately. And also the advice for surveying local wildlife sites is every 10 years. So within that time, it can pass hands once or twice, perhaps. But yeah, you can contact us and we can try and speak to the landowner if we've got, we know where they are. But all we can do is provide advice on how best to manage it. There's no obligation. It would lose its designation if it no longer met criteria, but that would require a full survey for us to determine that. I think that was answering everything.
Yeah, great, thank you. Claire has asked, you said that volunteers help with the management of some local wildlife sites. Is that something Cheshire Wildlife Trust organise, or would there need to be a separate group?
So I believe with Paddington Meadows in Warrington that we have provided advice and assistance in the past, but it is mainly organised by people in the local area and whoever owns the site. But we would certainly be interested in helping people out there more to know what local wildlife sites are near them and perhaps kind of help them in setting up those groups, which they can then maintain on their own. I think it's a really powerful tool for a lot of sites out there. So yes, I think that answers that.
Roger has asked, how does a non-statutory site become a fully statutory one?
Quite rarely. Things like SSSIs just don't get designated that often. And as I say, they're designated best on because they're kind of the best example of something in a whole region. So we usually kind of already have those sorted, and then local wildlife sites are the next level down. I don't know about the process in detail, but yeah, it just happens quite rarely. That's the kind of best way to explain it.
But that would be Natural England
Yes.
would be the ones to designate a SSSI or anything of national designations, and so that kind of is way beyond our local remit.
Stephen, I can see you've got your hand up. So I have allowed your microphone if you wanted to ask the question yourself. That's why your hand's up. You should be able to unmute yourself. Okay. So you have, I think you asked it in the chat as well. So would any of the Mersey estuary qualify for Ramsar status, as is the Dee estuary?
So the Mersey estuary is already a Ramsar site. Is the Dee?
Yes, both the estuaries
well.
are Ramsar sites. Yes.
Yeah. So that's a Ramsar is an international designation for a wetland. So it's kind of one of the highest designations that an estuary or a wetland site can get.
Another question is, what's the smallest site that would be considered? Thinking maybe grass verge. Also, I would assume with a road verge that the landowner would be the council.
Yeah, we do. We have a couple of local wildlife sites that are road verges, and I think in both cases they are the council, so we provide management advice to the council. The size limit depends on the habitat type. So, for example, ancient woodland, there is no size restriction because it's an irreplaceable habitat. So it doesn't matter how small it is, we would still consider it. And as I say, there's certain things in the criteria that are inherently small, such as we've got criteria for ancient and woodland trees. But yeah, some of these road verges that are designated are really small, like in terms of area, but they're really important. So
lovely, thank you, Laura. Madeline has asked, can Cheshire Wildlife Trust provide any support to local groups with landowners of local wildlife sites to encourage them to control invasive species such as Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed? The JK may require external expenditure. Can Cheshire Wildlife Trust assist with sourcing funding?
that's a big question. It's a difficult one to fund. I mean, in terms of invasive species, as a landowner, you do have an obligation, whether it's a local wildlife site or not, to control the spread of invasive species. But we at Cheshire Wildlife Trust don't enforce that. Again, with local wildlife sites, so it would just be kind of reiterating that advice and making them aware of the obligation. I don't to obviously I can't think of any pots of money available at the moment. I don't know about anyone else in the call, but this is one of the things when we're hopeful when the LNRS is published, the local nature recovery strategy. It's got lots of different priorities in there for nature's recovery across Cheshire, and tackling invasive species, particularly on nature conservation sites, will be important. And so we're hoping there will be more funding and incentives available.
Thank you. Janet has asked, what is the latest news about Danes Moss Reserve since the housing development was turned down by Cheshire East?
Yeah, so this is one that keeps coming up in bits. As far as I remember, the plans for the development were withdrawn because they went against Cheshire East's policies. And I believe the council has come to some sort of decision to reject large-scale applications on Danes Moss, but there's currently a very small, like 8-house application in, which we've commented on or sent an objection in. So it doesn't seem that too much is resolved, but it seems to be winding down a little bit. Yeah, sorry, I don't have any more specific details than that.
Thank you. I think that's it now for questions. I think that's all of them answered.
Brilliant. So if no one else has any more questions, we'll wrap up the webinar for today. So thank you all so much for attending. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, a link to the recording will be emailed to you in the coming days, and the recording will also be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you go onto YouTube and just search Cheshire Wildlife Trust, our channel will pop up and you'll be able to see all our videos on there, including past webinars as well as this one. And the appeal is still open, so please feel free to share it amongst your networks. We're very close to our goal, so we'd love to achieve that. And there is another question.
I think we'd already answered that one from Claire about volunteers.
Yeah, so I wrote a text answer to that one. But yes, we do have a volunteer program, so please do get in touch with us. But also, I don't know if Laura can support me on this one, but lots of local wildlife sites are often looked after by friends of groups and local volunteer groups, aren't they, Laura?
Yeah, there are some examples of that. It is the rarity, but
Okay.
yes, no, there are some examples, but it's something. Well, we used to have a big team of local wildlife site volunteer surveyors as well, that will hopefully be expanding on in future years. So it's a lot of potential.
Brilliant. So if anyone's keen to get involved and help Laura survey sites, please get in touch with us. The email address is volunteering@cheshirewt.org.uk, but you will be able to find that email address on our website as well. So if that's everything, we will end with thanks, Kevin. Glad you enjoyed it. Thanks very much, everyone.